What if the thoughts you repeat every day are quietly shaping the life you experience? You wake up already thinking about your problems, your responsibilities, your doubts, and everything you believe might go wrong. Before the day really begins, your mind may have already influenced how you feel, what you avoid, and what you decide to do. But your thoughts do not have to control you. In this audiobook, you will learn how to recognize limiting beliefs, question negative thinking, control your attention, build stronger mental habits, and use constructive self-talk to make better decisions. You will also discover how small daily actions can reshape your confidence, discipline, and direction over time. This is not about pretending everything is positive. It is about thinking more clearly and acting more deliberately. Stay until the end, because the final lesson may change how you understand personal growth. And if you value practical ideas for building a stronger mind and better life, subscribe to Audiobook Legacy for more audiobooks. Chapter 1. Examine your thoughts to uncover patterns shaping your everyday choices. You can go through an entire day making decisions without realizing how many of them were made before you consciously chose anything. You wake up and reach for your phone, not because you decided it was the best use of your morning, but because your mind expected it. You delay an important task because a quiet thought says you are not ready. You answer a message immediately because you feel uncomfortable leaving someone waiting. You avoid a difficult conversation because you imagine how badly it might go. None of these moments necessarily feels like a major decision, yet together they shape your habits, your relationships, your confidence, and eventually the direction of your life. The problem is not that you have thoughts you dislike. The deeper problem is that many thoughts operate unnoticed, and when a thought remains unnoticed, it can quietly influence behavior as though it were a fact. Your mind produces an enormous stream of reactions throughout the day. Some are useful observations, others are predictions, assumptions, memories, fears, preferences, and automatic judgments. A thought can appear with such speed that you experience it less like an idea and more like reality. You might think, "I am going to mess this up," and immediately feel tension. You might think, "They probably do not respect me," and suddenly interpret an ordinary comment as criticism. You might think, "I do not have enough time," and begin rushing before checking what actually needs to be done. The emotional response can make the original thought feel even more convincing. This is one reason people struggle to examine their thinking. They do not simply have thoughts. They experience thoughts through emotions, physical sensations, memories, and learned expectations. Consider someone who repeatedly postpones exercise. On the surface, the behavior appears to be a problem of discipline, but before the behavior comes a sequence of thoughts. The person may wake up and think, "I slept badly, so today will be difficult." Then comes, "I can make up for it tomorrow." The decision feels reasonable because the mind is protecting immediate comfort. By evening, the person may feel disappointed and conclude, "I am just not disciplined." That final judgment creates another thought pattern, one that attacks identity rather than examining behavior. The next morning, the same person is no longer simply deciding whether to exercise. They are carrying the belief that they are someone who fails to follow through. A small repeated choice has become a psychological expectation. This is why examining your thoughts requires more honesty than simply trying to think positively. Positive thinking can become another form of avoidance when it ignores what is actually happening inside you. If you are anxious about a difficult responsibility, telling yourself that everything will be fine may provide temporary relief without changing the underlying pattern. A more useful approach is to become precise. What exactly are you thinking? What are you predicting? What are you assuming? What evidence supports the thought? What evidence challenges it? Most importantly, what action does this thought encourage you to take? These questions create distance between the thought and the decision. You are no longer asking whether the thought feels convincing. You are asking whether it deserves authority. Pay attention to the language your mind uses when pressure appears. Words such as always, never, everyone, nothing, and I cannot often reveal patterns rather than objective facts. Imagine receiving a short email from your manager saying, "Can we talk this afternoon?" Your mind might immediately produce the conclusion that you have done something wrong. Your stomach tightens, your concentration drops, and you spend the next several hours reviewing everything you said during the week. But the email itself contained very little information. The rest came from your interpretation. Perhaps your manager wants your opinion about a project. Perhaps there is a scheduling issue. Perhaps there is criticism. You do not know yet. The disciplined response is not to force yourself into optimism. It is to recognize uncertainty without turning uncertainty into a negative conclusion. This distinction becomes especially important because the brain naturally looks for familiar explanations. If you have experienced rejection, criticism, instability, or repeated disappointment, your mind may become quick to detect similar possibilities. That does not mean you are weak. It means your previous experiences have influenced what your attention notices first. A person who has repeatedly been ignored may interpret a delayed text as rejection. Someone who grew up around constant conflict may become highly alert to changes in another person's tone. Someone who has failed publicly may avoid opportunities that could expose them to another failure. The mind is attempting to protect the person using information from the past, but protection is not always the same as accuracy. You can begin changing this process by creating small moments of observation throughout your day. When you notice a strong emotional reaction, pause before acting. You do not need a long meditation session or a complicated psychological exercise. Ask yourself what happened, what you immediately thought about it, what emotion followed, and what action you now feel pulled toward. Suppose a coworker disagrees with your proposal and you instantly feel irritated. Before defending yourself, identify the thought underneath the irritation. Maybe it is, "They are trying to undermine me." That thought creates defensiveness. Now consider another possibility. "They see a problem I have not considered." You do not have to believe the second interpretation either. The purpose is to recognize that more than one interpretation exists. Once you see that, you regain the ability to choose your response. Your private thoughts also deserve examination because they influence how you behave when nobody is watching. Listen to what you tell yourself after making a mistake. Some people immediately say, "I knew I would fail." Others think, "I always do this." Another person may decide, "There is no point trying again." These statements seem like simple reactions, but they can determine what happens next. A mistake can become information, or it can become evidence for a negative identity. The difference often begins with the interpretation attached to the event. A disciplined mind does not deny failure, it studies it. What specifically went wrong? What part was within your control? What should be changed next time? This turns an emotional experience into useful information. The same process applies to positive experiences. If you complete an important project, keep a difficult promise, or handle a stressful situation with restraint, notice how your mind explains the success. You might dismiss it as luck, timing, or something anyone could have done. If that becomes your default interpretation, your achievements will not necessarily strengthen your confidence. Confidence grows more reliably when you recognize the behaviors that produced a result. You prepared, you stayed focused, you asked for clarification. You continued after becoming frustrated. You made a difficult decision and accepted its consequences. Identifying those facts teaches your mind what effective behavior looks like. Over time, this practice changes something fundamental. You begin noticing that there is a difference between having a thought and obeying it. Fear can be present without determining your decision. Doubt can appear without becoming your conclusion. Anger can be felt without becoming your behavior. Laziness can be experienced without receiving permission to control your schedule. This is where mental discipline becomes practical. Self-control does not require you to eliminate every unwanted thought. It requires you to stop treating every thought as an instruction. At the end of the day, take a few minutes to review the decisions that mattered. Do not judge yourself broadly. Examine specific moments. Where did you act deliberately? Where did you react automatically? What thought appeared immediately before each reaction? You may discover that certain situations repeatedly produce the same internal response. Perhaps criticism makes you defensive. Uncertainty makes you procrastinate. Fatigue makes you impulsive. Rejection makes you withdraw. Once these patterns become visible, they become workable. You cannot responsibly change a pattern you refuse to notice. This is the beginning of taking ownership of your mind. You are not responsible for every thought that enters your awareness, but you are increasingly responsible for which thoughts you accept, reinforce, and translate into action. Your daily life is influenced not only by what happens to you, but by the meaning your mind assigns to what happens. And once you learn to observe that process carefully, a deeper question begins to emerge. If some of your strongest beliefs were learned rather than chosen, how many of them are still worthy of controlling the person you are becoming? Chapter 2. Challenge limiting beliefs before they quietly control your behavior. Sometimes the biggest obstacle in your life is not a lack of ability, opportunity, or discipline. It is a conclusion you accepted long ago and stopped questioning. You may believe you are bad with money, uncomfortable speaking in groups, incapable of staying consistent, too old to change direction, not intelligent enough for a certain career, or simply someone who never follows through. The belief may feel so familiar that you no longer experience it as a belief. It feels like a description of who you are, and that is where it becomes dangerous. Once the mind turns an assumption into an identity, behavior begins organizing itself around that assumption. You hesitate before applying. You remain silent when you have something valuable to say. You stop trying after one difficult week. Then the result seems to confirm the original belief, even though the belief helped create the result. Limiting beliefs rarely arrive as dramatic statements. More often, they appear as ordinary thoughts that sound reasonable. That is just not my personality. I have never been good at that. People like me do not succeed in those environments. I need to feel confident first. I always lose motivation. Because these statements contain some connection to past experience, they can be difficult to challenge. Perhaps you really have struggled with consistency. Perhaps you have made financial mistakes. Perhaps you once embarrassed yourself while speaking publicly. But a past pattern is not automatically a permanent identity. The mind often takes something that happened repeatedly and quietly converts it into something it believes must always happen. That conversion can happen without your permission. Imagine someone named Daniel who has worked in the same position for several years. He wants to apply for a management role, but every time an opportunity appears, he tells himself he is not leadership material. He remembers moments when he avoided confrontation and times when he made mistakes under pressure. Instead of treating those experiences as skills that can be developed, he uses them as evidence that the position belongs to someone else. He never applies. When another colleague receives the promotion, Daniel thinks, "I knew I was not ready." What he misses is the most important fact. He never gave himself the opportunity to discover whether he could become ready. His belief prevented the experiment that could have challenged it. This is how limiting beliefs protect themselves. They influence behavior in ways that produce evidence supporting the original conclusion. A person who believes they are socially awkward may avoid conversations, which means they receive less practice. Because they receive less practice, conversations remain uncomfortable. The discomfort then becomes proof that they are socially awkward. Someone who believes they are financially irresponsible may avoid looking closely at their spending because the numbers make them uncomfortable. The lack of awareness allows poor decisions to continue, reinforcing the belief. Someone who believes they cannot maintain healthy habits may approach every attempt with suspicion, expecting failure before the routine has had time to develop. The belief is not merely describing behavior, it is helping generate it. The first practical step is to separate facts from interpretations. Take a belief such as, "I am terrible at managing my time." What are the actual facts? Perhaps you regularly underestimate how long tasks take. Perhaps you check your phone during focused work. Perhaps you agree to too many commitments. Those are behaviors. They can be measured, changed, and improved. "I am terrible at managing my time" is an interpretation of those behaviors. The distinction matters because behaviors can be trained. Identity statements often make change feel pointless. When you describe yourself as permanently flawed, you remove the specific problem that could otherwise be addressed. You should also examine the origin of a belief. Ask yourself when you first remember thinking this way and what experiences contributed to it. A person may believe they are unintelligent because a teacher once criticized them. Another may believe they are difficult to love because a previous relationship ended badly. Someone may believe that asking for help makes them weak because they learned early that dependence was unacceptable. The origin does not automatically make the belief false, but it gives you context. You begin to see that some conclusions were formed under specific circumstances by a younger version of yourself with limited information. A belief can be understandable without being accurate enough to guide your present life. There is another important question. What does this belief cause you to do? Suppose you believe that people will judge you whenever you make a mistake. That belief may cause you to over-prepare, avoid responsibility, refuse unfamiliar tasks, or become defensive when corrected. The emotional cost can be significant. You may experience anxiety before ordinary situations and relief whenever you escape them. That relief is important because it can train avoidance. Every time you avoid something uncomfortable, your brain receives immediate confirmation that avoidance worked. The problem is that short-term relief can create long-term restriction. A more disciplined response is to test the belief through controlled action. If you believe you cannot speak confidently in meetings, do not demand that yourself become charismatic overnight. Speak once during the next meeting. Prepare one clear point and deliver it without trying to impress anyone. If you believe you cannot manage money, track every expense for 7 days before making a complicated financial plan. If you believe you cannot concentrate, set aside 20 minutes for one task with your phone out of reach and observe what actually happens. The purpose is not to prove that every negative belief is false. The purpose is to gather better evidence than assumption alone can provide. This approach requires patience because the mind often wants certainty immediately. You may take one uncomfortable action and still feel nervous. That does not mean the belief was correct. It means your emotional system has not yet adjusted to the new behavior. Confidence frequently develops after repeated evidence rather than before it. If you wait until you feel completely prepared, you may remain trapped inside the old pattern. A more reliable standard is whether your actions are becoming more deliberate. You can be nervous and still speak. You can be uncertain and still decide. You can feel inexperienced and still practice. Be careful, however, not to replace one rigid belief with another. Telling yourself, "I can accomplish absolutely anything if I just believe in myself," can create unrealistic expectations. A mature mindset does not require unlimited confidence. It requires accurate thinking. There will be abilities you need to develop, situations you are not prepared for, and goals that may need to change. Challenging limiting beliefs means becoming more truthful, not more optimistic. If you are weak in a particular skill, acknowledge it. Then ask what training, experience, or support would improve it. Honest assessment gives you something to work with. Harsh identity judgments do not. Your environment can also reinforce beliefs without you noticing. If you spend most of your time around people who constantly describe themselves as powerless, incompetent, unlucky, or incapable of change, those explanations can begin to sound normal. Likewise, repeated exposure to people who take responsibility for their choices can influence your own standards. This does not mean blaming other people for your mindset. Responsibility remains yours. It simply means recognizing that repeated messages shape what the mind considers believable. Be selective about the explanations you repeatedly consume, especially when they encourage helplessness. One of the strongest ways to weaken a limiting belief is to keep promises that are small enough to fulfill. If you tell yourself you will work for 30 minutes and you consistently do it, you create evidence that your behavior can be trusted. If you decide to stop checking your phone during the first hour of work and maintain that boundary, you strengthen your capacity for deliberate choice. These actions may appear unrelated to a belief about your potential, but psychologically they matter because they change your relationship with your own word. You begin developing evidence that you can make a decision and follow it without waiting for perfect motivation. Eventually, the goal is not to eliminate every doubt. Doubt is part of being human. The goal is to prevent doubt from becoming an unquestioned authority. When a limiting thought appears, you can acknowledge it without surrendering to it. You can ask what is factual, what is assumed, what was learned, what has changed, and what small action would provide better evidence. That process turns the mind from a source of automatic conclusions into an instrument for deliberate judgment. And there is a deeper lesson beneath all of this. Many of the beliefs that control your behavior remain powerful because they are rarely examined at the exact moment they influence a decision. Once you learn to question them, another challenge appears. Even when you recognize that a belief is limiting, your emotions may still push you toward the old behavior. The next step, then, is not simply changing what you believe, but learning to notice what happens inside you when your beliefs are challenged. Chapter 3. Choose empowering thoughts that support deliberate and consistent action. The quality of your actions is often decided by the thought you allow to remain in your mind just before you act. Two people can face the same demanding morning, receive the same difficult assignment, and have the same amount of time available, yet respond completely differently because of the internal direction they give themselves. One thinks, "This is going to be exhausting, and I probably will not finish." The other thinks, "This requires attention, so I will begin with the first part and deal with the rest when I reach it." Neither thought changes the size of the assignment, neither removes fatigue or uncertainty, but one creates hesitation while the other creates movement. This is where empowering thought becomes practical. It is not about making yourself feel good. It is about choosing thoughts that make responsible action easier to initiate and sustain. Many people misunderstand the relationship between thought and behavior because they expect useful thinking to produce immediate confidence. That is not always how the mind works. A useful thought can exist alongside discomfort. You can tell yourself, "I can handle this conversation carefully," while still feeling nervous about it. You can think, I will finish the task before checking my phone while feeling the urge to escape into distraction. The purpose of an empowering thought is not to eliminate resistance. Its purpose is to give you a better instruction while resistance is present. This distinction matters because waiting for the right emotional state gives your feelings too much authority over your behavior. Discipline becomes stronger when your thoughts guide your actions, even when your emotions are not cooperating. Consider someone who arrives home after a long workday and knows the kitchen needs cleaning, several emails need attention, and tomorrow's schedule needs preparation. The first thought might be, "I have no energy for any of this." That thought focuses attention on the entire burden at once. The emotional result is heaviness, and the natural response is postponement. A more useful thought would be, "I do not need to finish everything immediately. I need to begin with the task that matters most." The circumstances have not changed. The person is still tired. The responsibilities remain, but the second thought creates a manageable decision instead of a global complaint. This is an important function of deliberate thinking. It converts an overwhelming experience into a specific action. The mind also responds differently to questions than statements. When you repeatedly tell yourself, "Why am I always behind?" your attention tends to search for evidence of failure. When you ask, "What is causing the delay today?" you direct attention toward a solvable problem. If you think, "Why can I never stay focused?" you reinforce an identity centered around difficulty. If you ask, "What is interrupting my attention right now?" you can investigate the environment, the task, your physical state, or your habits. The wording of an internal question can influence what information your mind notices next. A disciplined person therefore learns to ask questions that lead toward responsibility rather than helplessness. This becomes especially valuable during moments of frustration. Imagine that you have spent 2 hours working on something and discover that you made a significant mistake. The immediate thought may be, "I wasted all that time." That thought can trigger anger, discouragement, and the desire to abandon the task. But another thought is available. "The error is here. What does it tell me about what needs to change?" The second response does not pretend the mistake is insignificant. It acknowledges the cost while directing attention toward recovery. The difference between the two thoughts is not positive versus negative thinking. It is whether the thought helps you respond intelligently to the situation. Empowering thoughts also need to be believable enough for your mind to accept them. If you are facing a difficult presentation and tell yourself, "I am going to be completely fearless and perform perfectly," your experience may immediately contradict the statement. You feel nervous, notice one mistake, and conclude that your positive thinking failed. A more grounded thought might be, "I can prepare carefully, speak clearly, and recover if I lose my place." That statement does not promise perfection. It identifies behaviors within your control. This is closer to a Stoic approach because it places attention on preparation, conduct, and response, rather than demanding a particular outcome. Your internal language becomes especially important when consistency is required. Most meaningful changes are not difficult because of one extraordinary decision. They are difficult because the same useful decision must be repeated when novelty disappears. A person may begin studying with enthusiasm on Monday and then encounter boredom by Thursday. If the thought is, "I have lost motivation, so this is not working," the routine becomes dependent on emotion. If the thought is, "Motivation is lower today, but the commitment remains," behavior no longer has to wait for enthusiasm. The thought supports continuity. That is what makes it empowering. It protects the action from temporary emotional fluctuations. There is also a subtle difference between demanding action from yourself and directing yourself toward action. Harsh internal commands can sometimes produce short bursts of effort, but they often create resentment and exhaustion when repeated. Someone who constantly thinks, "I have to do more, I am falling behind, I am never doing enough," may appear disciplined while privately operating under chronic pressure. A more constructive internal standard is specific and measured. I will complete the most important task before I decide what comes next. This creates structure without turning every moment into a judgment of personal worth. Self-control becomes sustainable when it is guided by clear standards rather than constant self-criticism. Pay attention to how your thoughts behave when plans change. You may intend to exercise after work, but an unexpected responsibility keeps you late. You might think, "The whole day is ruined." That thought encourages abandoning the rest of your commitments because the original plan was interrupted. A more flexible thought would be, "The original plan is no longer possible, so I will choose the next available version." Perhaps you walk for 20 minutes instead of going to the gym. Perhaps you prepare tomorrow's workout clothes and protect an earlier time. The empowering thought does not preserve the exact plan, it preserves the principle behind the plan. This distinction helps people remain consistent without becoming rigid. The same principle applies to relationships. Suppose someone speaks to you disrespectfully. Your first thought may be, "They are trying to provoke me, so I need to respond immediately." That thought can turn irritation into confrontation. A more deliberate thought is, "I can decide how much attention this deserves before responding." You may still address the behavior, but you are less likely to surrender control of your response to another person's emotional state. This is a practical form of self-respect. You do not need to suppress your feelings or pretend that disrespect does not matter. You simply refuse to let the first emotional interpretation dictate your next action. A useful daily practice is to identify one situation where your usual thinking tends to reduce your effectiveness and prepare an alternative thought before the situation occurs. If mornings usually produce procrastination, decide in advance, "When I sit down, I will work for 10 minutes before evaluating how I feel." If difficult emails make you avoid your inbox, decide, "I will read the message once, identify the actual request, and respond to the facts." If uncertainty causes endless research, decide, "I will gather enough information to make a reasonable decision, then choose." Preparation matters because thoughts are easier to direct before emotional pressure becomes intense. Over time, empowering thoughts begin changing your standards for what counts as progress. Instead of asking whether you felt motivated, you start asking whether you acted according to your intention. Instead of asking whether a difficult situation was comfortable, you ask whether you handled it with self-control. Instead of judging an entire day by one mistake, you examine whether you corrected it responsibly. These questions gradually shift attention away from emotional convenience and toward deliberate conduct. The mind becomes less occupied with evaluating how life feels in each moment and more concerned with deciding how you will behave within the circumstances you have. There will still be days when your thinking is scattered, pessimistic, impatient, or uncertain. The goal is not mental perfection. The goal is to develop enough awareness to notice when your thoughts are making responsible action harder than necessary. Once you notice that, you have a choice. You can continue feeding the thought, or you can replace it with something more accurate, more useful, and more connected to what you can actually do. That choice may seem small, but repeated choices become patterns of attention, and patterns of attention influence behavior. Eventually, you begin to understand that an empowering mindset is not a collection of cheerful statements you repeat when life becomes difficult. It is a disciplined method of thinking that keeps your attention connected to reality, responsibility, and action. You stop asking your thoughts to make life easier and start asking them to make your response wiser. but even useful thoughts can lose their influence when your attention is constantly being pulled in different directions. The next question is therefore more demanding. What happens when you know exactly what you should think and do, yet your mind keeps giving something else your attention? Chapter 4. Redirect negative thinking by questioning assumptions behind emotional reactions. You receive a message that says, "We need to talk," and within seconds your mood changes. Your chest tightens, your attention narrows, and your mind begins constructing explanations before you know what the conversation is even about. Maybe you assume you have disappointed someone. Maybe you expect criticism. Maybe you decide they are angry with you. Nothing concrete has happened yet, but emotionally, you are already responding to an event that exists mainly inside your interpretation. This is one of the most important problems in negative thinking. The mind often reacts not to what happened, but to what it believes what happened means. When that meaning is based on an unchecked assumption, emotion can become intense long before reality has been established. Negative thinking is rarely as simple as choosing to be pessimistic. Often, it begins with the mind attempting to make sense of uncertainty quickly. Humans naturally prefer explanations to unanswered questions. When information is incomplete, the brain fills gaps. If you have been criticized before, you may interpret a neutral expression as disapproval. If you have experienced rejection, you may notice signs of exclusion where none were intended. If someone has broken your trust, you may become suspicious of ordinary behavior. The mind is trying to reduce uncertainty by producing a conclusion, but speed does not guarantee accuracy. An assumption can feel convincing simply because it arrives quickly and connects with something you already fear. This becomes especially visible in close relationships. Imagine that your partner comes home unusually quiet. You ask whether something is wrong, and they say, "I'm just tired." Your mind may immediately respond, "They are upset with me." From there, you become quieter yourself. You stop asking questions because you do not want to make things worse. Your partner notices the distance and becomes confused. Now both people are behaving differently because of an assumption that was never tested. A few hours later, the original tension may appear to have been caused by the relationship, when in reality it began with one interpretation. This is how emotional reactions can create the very circumstances they fear. The first discipline is learning to distinguish observation from interpretation. "He did not respond to my message for 6 hours" is an observation. "He is ignoring me because he does not care" is an interpretation. "My manager corrected my work" is an observation. "My manager thinks I am incompetent" is an interpretation. "My friend cancelled dinner" is an observation. "She does not value our friendship" is an interpretation. The difference may appear small, but it creates a major change in emotional control. Observations describe what you know. Interpretations attempt to explain what you do not yet know. When you confuse the two, you give your assumptions the authority of facts. This does not mean every negative interpretation is wrong. Sometimes people really are disappointed. Sometimes criticism is justified. Sometimes a relationship is unhealthy. Sometimes someone is deliberately disrespectful. Emotional maturity does not require you to explain away unpleasant realities. It requires you to investigate before deciding what they mean. If someone repeatedly violates an agreement, you should not dismiss the pattern simply because you want to remain positive. Instead, examine the behavior carefully and respond according to evidence. Questioning assumptions is not the same as refusing to believe what is happening. It is a method for making sure your conclusion is proportional to the facts. A useful question during an emotional reaction is, what else could explain this? Suppose your supervisor gives a coworker an opportunity you wanted. Your first reaction may be, "They clearly do not see my value." but other explanations may exist. Perhaps your coworker has experience that specifically matches the assignment. Perhaps your supervisor made a temporary decision. Perhaps your own performance needs improvement in an area you have not noticed. Perhaps there was no judgment of you at all. You do not need to choose the most flattering explanation. You need to resist choosing the most painful explanation without evidence. That pause protects you from making decisions while emotionally narrowing your perspective. Negative thinking also becomes stronger when the mind treats one event as evidence of a larger pattern. You make a mistake during a presentation and think, "I always embarrass myself." One argument occurs and you think, "We can never communicate." You miss one workout and conclude, "I cannot stay consistent." These statements feel emotionally accurate because disappointment is present, but they expand a specific event into a broad identity or prediction. A disciplined mind returns to precision. What happened today? What specifically failed? What remains intact? What can be corrected? Precision reduces the emotional exaggeration that often accompanies disappointment. Another source of unnecessary negativity is mind reading. You see someone looking serious and assume they are angry with you. You receive a short email and assume the sender is annoyed. Someone declines an invitation and you conclude they no longer enjoy your company. The mind dislikes ambiguity, so it creates a story that closes the gap. But people are often occupied with problems you cannot see. Their mood may have nothing to do with you. Their brief response may reflect fatigue, urgency, or distraction. If you treat every unknown motive as a personal judgment, your emotional state becomes dependent on information you do not possess. You can interrupt this habit by delaying interpretation until more information is available. This does not require emotional suppression. You can notice that you feel rejected without deciding that you have been rejected. You can feel insulted without immediately concluding that someone intended to insult you. You can feel anxious without assuming that the feared outcome is likely. This distinction creates psychological space. The emotion remains real, but its explanation becomes provisional. That is a powerful form of self-control because you are allowing yourself to experience the feeling without allowing the feeling to become the final verdict. Consider how this changes decision-making at work. You receive critical feedback on a project and feel embarrassed. Your mind says, "They think I am not capable." If you believe that interpretation, you may become defensive, avoid future responsibility, or spend the evening replaying the conversation. Instead, you can ask, what exactly did they criticize? Perhaps the feedback concerned one specific issue that can be corrected. You can separate the quality of the work from the value of your identity. This allows criticism to become useful information rather than a threat to your self-respect. The ability to receive correction without collapsing emotionally is one of the quiet forms of resilience that becomes more valuable with experience. There is also a practical reason to question emotional assumptions before acting. Emotions change faster than consequences. You can feel intense anger for 10 minutes and send a message that damages a relationship for months. You can feel anxious about a decision and avoid an opportunity that could have changed your circumstances. You can feel humiliated by a mistake and quit something that was beginning to improve. The feeling may be temporary, but the action taken under its influence can remain. This is why a brief pause can be more valuable than a powerful emotional response. Before sending the message, making the accusation, quitting the project, or making the purchase, ask whether the decision still makes sense after the emotional intensity decreases. A simple practice is to write down the event and the story your mind immediately attached to it. Then write what you actually know. Finally, identify what information is missing. This forces the mind to separate evidence from prediction. Suppose your friend has not replied. What you know is that there has been no response. What you are assuming might be that they are upset. What you do not know includes why they have not replied, what they are doing, and when they will respond. This exercise may seem almost too simple, but simplicity is useful when emotion makes thinking complicated. You are creating a habit of intellectual restraint. Over time, you may notice that certain emotional reactions have predictable assumptions underneath them. Anger may often contain an assumption that someone is disrespecting you. Jealousy may contain an assumption that you are being replaced. Anxiety may contain an assumption that you will not be able to cope with what happens next. Shame may contain an assumption that one mistake defines your worth. Once you recognize the structure, you can respond more intelligently. Instead of fighting the emotion directly, examine the conclusion producing its intensity. Sometimes changing the conclusion reduces the emotion. Other times the emotion remains, but you become less controlled by it. This is where a Stoic approach becomes practical rather than philosophical. You cannot control every event, every person's intentions, or every first reaction your nervous system produces. You can control whether you investigate before judging, whether you speak before understanding, and whether you act while emotionally charged. Your responsibility is not to guarantee that your interpretation will always be correct. It is to make your best judgment with the information available and remain willing to revise it when new facts appear. Eventually, you begin to see that negative thinking is not always a problem of negativity itself. Often, it is a problem of certainty. The mind takes a possibility and treats it as a fact, takes a feeling and treats it as evidence, or takes one event and treats it as a permanent pattern. Once you learn to question those assumptions, emotional reactions become less commanding, but there is another layer waiting underneath them. Even when you understand that a thought may be inaccurate, your mind can still return to it repeatedly, especially when it has become familiar. The next challenge is learning how to change the mental habits that keep unwanted thoughts returning long after you have recognized them. Chapter 5. Strengthen self-awareness by observing thoughts without automatically believing them. You can have a thought several times in one day and never stop to consider that it is only a thought. It may say that you are falling behind, that someone is judging you, that you need to check your phone, that you should avoid an uncomfortable task, or that you are not in the mood to do something important. Because the thought appears in your own voice, it can feel unusually trustworthy. You rarely question the voice inside your head in the same way you would question a stranger making the same claim. Yet self-awareness begins when you become curious about that voice. Not suspicious of every thought, not frightened by your own mind, but attentive enough to notice what is happening internally before it becomes behavior. Most people spend surprisingly little time observing their mental activity. They move from one task to another while thoughts remain in the background, influencing attention without being examined. You might be driving to work while mentally rehearsing an argument from yesterday. You might be preparing dinner while imagining a problem that could happen tomorrow. You might be sitting with friends while mentally comparing your life with someone else's. Your body is in one place while your attention is somewhere else. This matters because attention determines what receives psychological energy. If you never notice where your attention goes, your mind can repeatedly spend that energy on concerns that do not deserve it. Self-awareness is therefore more than knowing your personality. It is the ability to recognize what is happening inside you while it is happening. You notice tension before irritation becomes an argument. You notice restlessness before you open another distracting app. You notice the urge to defend yourself before you interrupt someone. You notice the thought that says, "I need to solve this right now," before spending an hour worrying about a problem that cannot be solved tonight. This kind of awareness creates a small but valuable space between internal experience and outward behavior. In that space, choice becomes possible. Consider a person sitting at their desk, trying to complete an important report. After several minutes, a thought appears. I should check my messages. They check one message, then another, and eventually spend 20 minutes scrolling. The obvious explanation is poor discipline. But self-awareness asks a more interesting question. What was happening immediately before the urge to escape? Perhaps the report was becoming difficult. Perhaps the person reached a section where they did not know what to write. The phone was not necessarily the original problem. It was an attractive response to uncertainty and frustration. Once that pattern becomes visible, the person can address the actual difficulty instead of repeatedly fighting the distraction. This is why observing thoughts without believing them is different from suppressing thoughts. Suppression says, I should not be thinking this. Observation says, I notice that I am thinking this. The second response does not require an argument with the mind. If you suddenly think, I am going to fail, you do not have to replace it with an exaggerated positive statement. You can simply recognize, my mind is predicting failure right now. That sentence changes your relationship with the thought. The prediction becomes something you are observing rather than something you are preparing to obey. The distinction becomes even more useful with repetitive thoughts. Some people replay conversations for hours, trying to determine whether they sounded foolish. Others repeatedly imagine future problems, believing that enough analysis will eventually create certainty. Someone may mentally review a financial decision again and again after the decision has already been made. The mind presents repetition as problem solving, but repetition does not always produce new information. Sometimes it simply reinforces the same emotional pathway. Self-awareness allows you to recognize when thinking has stopped producing insight and started producing mental noise. A practical way to develop this awareness is to notice the physical signs that accompany recurring thoughts. Your jaw may tighten when you feel criticized. Your shoulders may rise when you anticipate pressure. You may become restless when you are avoiding an important decision. You may repeatedly touch your phone when you feel bored or uncertain. These physical signals can become early indicators of mental patterns. Instead of waiting until the behavior becomes obvious, you learn to notice the first changes. That gives you an earlier opportunity to choose differently. Self-awareness also changes how you understand emotion. People often say, I am angry, I am anxious, or I am stressed, as though the emotion completely describes their current state. A more precise observation might be, anger is present, or I notice anxiety increasing. This language is not about sounding detached or avoiding responsibility. It helps you remember that an emotional state is something you are experiencing, not the total definition of who you are. You can experience anger while choosing patience. You can experience anxiety while completing the necessary task. You can experience disappointment without allowing it to determine your behavior. Imagine that a family member makes a comment that irritates you during dinner. Your first impulse is to respond sharply. Instead, you notice the heat in your face, the tension in your body, and the thought, they always do this. You do not need to settle the disagreement immediately. You can listen for another moment and decide whether a response is necessary. That pause may prevent an argument, but its deeper value is that you learnt something about yourself. You discovered what kind of comment activates you, what story your mind immediately creates, and what behavior follows. Each observation adds to your understanding of your own operating patterns. This process is particularly important because people often judge themselves only after behavior occurs. They lose their temper and later feel guilty. They procrastinate and then criticize themselves at night. They spend impulsively and regret it when the statement arrives. A stronger form of self-awareness moves the observation earlier. Instead of asking, "Why did I do that?" you begin noticing, "What happens inside me just before I do that?" The second question is more useful because it identifies the moment where intervention is still possible. You can practice this during ordinary transitions. Before opening your computer, notice what you expect the next hour to feel like. Before entering a difficult conversation, notice what outcome you are already imagining. Before making an unnecessary purchase, notice what emotion you want the purchase to change. Before responding to criticism, notice whether your attention is focused on understanding or defending yourself. These brief observations do not require special circumstances. They turn everyday life into opportunities for psychological study without making life feel like a constant self-improvement project. There is also a danger in becoming excessively self-observant. You can analyze yourself so continuously that observation becomes another form of distraction. The purpose is not to monitor every thought or dissect every emotion. That would create another burden. Healthy self-awareness is selective. You notice what affects your decisions, relationships, attention, and responsibilities. Then you return to the task in front of you. Awareness should improve participation in life, not replace participation with endless internal analysis. A useful evening practice is to identify one moment when your mind influenced your behavior without you noticing it at first. Perhaps you became impatient because you were tired. Perhaps you avoided a task because it made you uncertain. Perhaps you sought reassurance because you were uncomfortable with not knowing the outcome. Do not turn the review into self-criticism. Ask what the sequence looked like. What happened? What did you notice? What did you think? What did you feel? What did you do? What might you notice earlier next time? This creates a practical feedback system. You are not merely remembering the day, you are learning how your mind operates under real conditions. With enough practice, an important change begins to occur. Thoughts lose some of their automatic authority. You can notice a craving without immediately satisfying it. You can notice insecurity without seeking reassurance. You can notice boredom without reaching for stimulation. You can notice the desire to complain without giving it an audience. The mind continues producing suggestions, predictions, memories, and impulses, but you become less compelled to respond to each one. This is a deeper form of freedom because it does not depend on controlling everything you think. It depends on becoming more deliberate about what you do with what you think. The Stoic perspective is useful here because it emphasizes disciplined attention rather than perfect internal control. You cannot prevent every thought from appearing. You cannot command yourself to feel only calm emotions. You cannot guarantee that your mind will remain focused throughout an entire day, but you can practice returning your attention when you notice it has wandered. You can recognize an impulse before acting on it. You can examine your internal state without turning every experience into a judgment about yourself. Repeatedly returning to awareness strengthens the habit of choosing rather than reacting. Eventually, you may discover something subtle. The thoughts that influence you most are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes the most powerful thoughts are quiet assumptions that operate beneath conscious attention. They tell you what is normal, what you deserve, what you should tolerate, what you should avoid, and what kind of effort is worth making. Because they are familiar, they rarely announce themselves. And that raises a deeper question. If your most influential thoughts can operate quietly beneath awareness, how can you deliberately build a mental environment that makes disciplined behavior easier to sustain? Chapter 6. Build mental habits that reinforce confidence, discipline, and personal responsibility. Confidence is often treated as a feeling you need before taking meaningful action, but in everyday life, confidence is frequently the result of what you repeatedly do. A person who keeps appointments with themselves, finishes what they said they would finish, admits mistakes without excuses, and handles ordinary responsibilities consistently begins to develop a different relationship with their own judgment. They become more willing to trust themselves because their behavior has provided evidence. This is why mental habits matter. The way you repeatedly interpret effort, responsibility, mistakes, discomfort, and commitment gradually shapes what you expect from yourself. You do not build confidence simply by thinking highly of yourself. You build it by developing a mind that expects responsible behavior from you and a routine that repeatedly confirms that expectation. One of the most important mental habits is learning to make decisions without constantly negotiating with yourself. Many people lose energy through internal bargaining. They decide to exercise, then ask whether today is really the right day. They plan to work for an hour, then wonder whether they should begin after lunch. They intend to save money, then create an exception because something feels deserved. The problem is not that flexibility is always wrong. The problem is that repeated negotiation teaches the mind that every commitment is provisional. Eventually, the question becomes less about whether the decision makes sense and more about whether you can find a reason to avoid it. A stronger habit is to decide carefully once and then treat the decision as a commitment unless circumstances genuinely change. This does not require becoming rigid. Responsibility includes judgment. If you plan to exercise but become sick, changing the plan may be sensible. If an unexpected family emergency appears, postponing work may be necessary. The mental habit to develop is not blind obedience to plans. It is honest evaluation. Ask whether the situation truly changed or whether your desire for comfort changed. Those are not the same thing. Fatigue may be real, but sometimes fatigue is simply the feeling that appears when an activity becomes inconvenient. Learning to distinguish genuine constraints from convenient resistance strengthens self-respect because you begin trusting your own decisions more carefully. Another mental habit involves changing the way you evaluate small actions. People often underestimate the psychological significance of ordinary follow-through. Sending the email you said you would send, arriving on time, cleaning your workspace, preparing tomorrow's clothes, completing a difficult conversation, or reviewing your spending may seem too minor to influence confidence. Yet these actions repeatedly answer a private question: can I rely on myself? When the answer becomes consistently yes, confidence becomes less dependent on external approval. You do not need everyone to recognize your discipline because you have direct evidence of it in your own behavior. The opposite pattern is equally powerful. When you repeatedly make promises to yourself and break them, the damage is often deeper than the unfinished task. You begin to expect inconsistency. You may create elaborate plans because planning feels productive, while privately knowing that execution will probably disappear when discomfort arrives. Eventually, the mind becomes skeptical of your intentions. This does not mean you should become harsh with yourself. It means you should make fewer promises and keep more of them. A modest commitment completed consistently is psychologically more valuable than an ambitious commitment repeatedly abandoned. This is where personal responsibility becomes more than accepting blame. Responsibility means recognizing your influence over what happens next. Suppose you arrive late to work because you underestimated the morning routine. You can explain the traffic, the weather, the unexpected delay, and the difficulty of waking up. Some of those factors may be legitimate, but if the same problem happens repeatedly, responsibility asks a different question: what part of this pattern can I change? Perhaps you need to leave 20 minutes earlier. Perhaps your evening routine needs adjustment. Perhaps you are agreeing to a schedule that is unrealistic. Responsibility does not deny circumstances. It identifies where your choices still matter. Confidence grows when this way of thinking becomes habitual. You stop using every obstacle as evidence that success is impossible and start treating obstacles as information about what needs to be adjusted. If you repeatedly underestimate how long tasks take, build more realistic estimates. If you frequently forget commitments, use a reliable system instead of trusting memory. If you become defensive when corrected, practice asking one clarifying question before responding. Mental discipline becomes concrete when it changes systems and behavior rather than remaining an idea you admire. Your relationship with mistakes also deserves attention. A fragile form of confidence depends on being right, competent and successful most of the time. That kind of confidence becomes unstable because ordinary life constantly provides opportunities to be wrong. Stronger confidence allows mistakes without turning them into identity crises. If you make a poor decision, acknowledge it directly, determine the consequence, repair what can be repaired, identify what should change, then move forward. This response teaches the mind that failure is uncomfortable but manageable. That belief can make you more willing to act because you no longer need the guarantee of success before beginning. There is a practical difference between self-criticism and self-correction. Self-criticism says, "I am careless." Self-correction says, "I missed the deadline because I did not schedule enough time, so I need to change how I plan." The first statement attacks identity without giving you a useful next step. The second identifies behavior and creates responsibility. If you want stronger discipline, become specific about your errors. General guilt can feel serious while accomplishing very little. Specific correction gives the mind a clear instruction. Another useful mental habit is finishing before rewarding yourself with distraction. Modern attention is constantly exposed to immediate stimulation, and the mind quickly learns to prefer activities that provide rapid satisfaction. If you repeatedly switch from difficult work to entertainment whenever discomfort appears, you train yourself to escape effort. A better pattern is to create clear boundaries around attention. Finish a defined portion of the task, then take a deliberate break. The break becomes a chosen recovery period rather than an escape from discomfort. Over time, this changes your relationship with effort because difficulty no longer automatically signals that something else should begin. The same principle applies to emotional discipline. Suppose you receive an irritating message while working. You feel an immediate urge to respond. Instead of acting on the first impulse, you finish the sentence you are writing, take a moment, and then decide whether a response is necessary. This small delay matters because it reinforces a mental habit. Emotion can be present without controlling timing. You are teaching yourself that urgency should be evaluated rather than automatically obeyed. Repeated enough times, this becomes part of your character. There is also value in deliberately practicing small acts of responsibility when nobody will reward you. Return something to its proper place. Complete an administrative task you have been avoiding. Admit that you forgot something instead of creating an excuse. Follow through on a commitment that no one would notice if you abandoned it. These moments are private training. They matter because character is strengthened through behavior that does not depend on an audience. When your standards remain intact without external supervision, your discipline becomes less fragile. You should also be careful with the belief that confidence requires constant certainty. Some of the most responsible decisions are made while uncertainty remains. You may not know whether a new career direction will work. You may not know how someone will respond to an honest conversation. You may not know whether a difficult project will succeed. The goal is not to eliminate uncertainty. It is to develop enough trust in your own ability to respond if circumstances change. That is a more durable form of confidence because it does not depend on predicting everything correctly. As these habits develop, your internal expectations begin to change. You become less impressed by intention and more attentive to follow through. You stop asking whether you feel ready and start asking whether you are prepared enough to take the next responsible step. You become more comfortable correcting yourself without humiliation. You begin to see discipline not as punishment, but as a way of making your future behavior more reliable. And reliability has an important psychological consequence. It reduces the amount of energy you spend arguing with yourself. Eventually, you realize that a disciplined mind is not built through one dramatic transformation. It is built through repeated decisions that seem ordinary while they are happening. Each time you keep a commitment, correct an error, delay an impulse, or accept responsibility without unnecessary excuses, you provide evidence about the kind of person you are becoming. But there is a limit to how much discipline can develop if your attention remains constantly divided. Even a strong commitment becomes difficult to maintain when the mind is trained to respond to every interruption. The next challenge is to examine what repeatedly captures your attention and decide what deserves it. Chapter 7. Control attention by deliberately choosing what deserves your mental energy. You can sit down with a clear intention to finish important work and still lose an entire hour without understanding exactly where the time went. One notification appears, then another thought interrupts, then you remember something unrelated, then you check a message, and suddenly the task in front of you feels harder than it did when you started. The problem is not always a lack of discipline. Often, it is that your attention has become available to too many competing demands. Every request, notification, headline, conversation, worry, and unfinished task can ask for a portion of your mental energy. If you respond to everything simply because it appears, you eventually lose the ability to decide what deserves your attention. And when attention becomes scattered, even simple responsibilities can feel unnecessarily difficult. Attention is not the same as time. You can have an hour available and still accomplish very little if your mind repeatedly leaves the activity in front of you. You can also spend 30 focused minutes accomplishing something that would otherwise consume 2 distracted hours. This distinction explains why people sometimes feel exhausted at the end of a busy day without being satisfied with what they completed. Their minds were active, but activity was divided among too many targets. They answered messages, checked updates, switched between tasks, worried about future problems, remembered unfinished responsibilities, and consumed information that demanded emotional reactions. Mental energy was spent, but not necessarily invested in something meaningful. One reason attention is difficult to control is that the mind is highly responsive to novelty. A new notification can feel more urgent than a familiar task. A fresh message offers immediate information, while a difficult project requires sustained effort before producing a reward. The brain therefore has a natural tendency to orient toward what is new, uncertain, or emotionally stimulating. This does not mean you are powerless against distraction. It means you need to understand why distraction feels attractive. If you treat every interruption as a personal failure, you may become frustrated without changing the conditions that make interruption easy. Imagine an employee trying to write an important proposal while keeping email open on a second screen. Nothing forces them to check every message, yet the visible presence of incoming mail creates a background expectation. Part of their attention remains available for the possibility of interruption. When a message arrives, they look. Even if the email requires only 30 seconds, returning to the original thought may take much longer. The cost is not the 30 seconds spent reading. The cost is the mental reconstruction required to return to the previous level of concentration. Repeated throughout the day, these small shifts can consume a remarkable amount of productive attention. This is why deliberate attention often begins with deciding what will not receive your attention. That decision can feel uncomfortable because modern life constantly presents information as though everything matters. Your phone can display breaking news, social updates, work messages, entertainment, financial information, and personal conversations within seconds. But availability does not equal importance. A message can be waiting without requiring an immediate response. A headline can be interesting without deserving your emotional reaction. Someone else's urgency does not automatically become your priority. Learning this distinction is an essential part of self-control. Consider how much mental energy can be spent on situations you cannot influence. You may repeatedly think about what another person thinks of you, whether a distant event will affect you, how someone might respond to a decision, or what could happen several months from now. Thinking can create the impression of preparation even when no useful action is being produced. Ask yourself whether your attention is leading to a decision, a plan, or an action. If it is not, the thought may be consuming energy without creating value. This does not mean ignoring legitimate concerns. It means recognizing when concern has become repetitive mental activity. A useful practice is to divide your concerns into what requires action, what requires patience, and what requires acceptance. If your bills need to be paid, that requires action. If you are waiting for someone to make a decision, that may require patience. If the weather has disrupted your plans, you may need acceptance and adjustment. Problems become psychologically heavier when all three categories are treated as though they require immediate mental control. You cannot force an answer from someone who has not decided. You cannot negotiate with weather. You can, however, decide what you will do with the circumstances you actually face. Attention is also influenced by emotional relevance. A minor criticism from someone you respect may occupy your mind for hours because it touches something important to you. Meanwhile, an urgent administrative task may receive little attention because it does not produce the same emotional intensity. This creates a difficult imbalance. The loudest thought can feel like the most important thought, but importance and emotional intensity are different qualities. A calm, ordinary responsibility may have far greater consequences than a dramatic thought that happens to demand your attention. Suppose you have an important deadline tomorrow, but you spend the evening thinking about a disagreement from the afternoon. The disagreement may deserve reflection, but perhaps it does not require 3 hours of mental rehearsal. Meanwhile, the deadline is becoming more urgent. If you allow emotional intensity to determine priority, your attention will move toward whatever feels strongest. A deliberate mind asks a different question. What deserves my attention based on consequences and responsibility? That question can redirect you even when your emotions are pulling elsewhere. Another powerful shift is learning to work with attention cycles rather than demanding constant concentration. You may not be able to maintain deep focus for several hours without interruption. Instead of interpreting that limitation as failure, structure your work around periods of focused effort followed by intentional recovery. During the focused period, remove unnecessary inputs. During the break, step away rather than filling the pause with another stream of information. If every break becomes 20 minutes of scrolling, your mind may return more stimulated but less settled. Recovery should restore attention, not simply replace one demanding input with another. The physical environment matters as well. If your phone sits beside you, face up and within reach, you have created a constant invitation to interrupt yourself. If entertainment is one click away from your work, you are asking willpower to make the same decision repeatedly. A stronger approach is to reduce the number of decisions required. Put the phone somewhere inconvenient during focused work. Close unnecessary applications. Keep only the materials related to the current task visible. These changes may seem simple, but they alter the number of opportunities your mind has to abandon its chosen direction. Your attention also needs protection from your own unfinished commitments. When several tasks remain unresolved, they can continue appearing mentally even while you are working on something else. Writing down pending responsibilities can reduce this pressure because the mind no longer has to keep rehearsing them to avoid forgetting. A clear external system allows you to say, "This is recorded, and I will address it at the appropriate time." Without that structure, your mind may repeatedly interrupt the present task with reminders about the future. Organization is therefore not merely a productivity technique. It can also protect psychological attention. There is a deeper issue beneath distraction. Sometimes people use distraction because the task in front of them creates an uncomfortable emotional state. A difficult assignment can produce uncertainty. An administrative task can create boredom. A conversation can create vulnerability. A long-term goal can produce fear about whether the effort will succeed. In those moments, attention shifts towards something easier. If you only remove the external distraction without addressing the discomfort, the mind may simply find another escape. You need to recognize the emotional reason you want to leave the task. Sometimes the most important thing to say internally is, "This is uncomfortable, but discomfort does not mean I need to stop." Attention also influences relationships. When someone speaks to you while you are mentally composing your next response, you may hear their words without fully receiving their meaning. When you constantly check your phone during conversations, you communicate that other information deserves immediate access to your attention. Deliberate attention, therefore, becomes a form of respect. Listening completely can be difficult because the mind wants to compare, respond, defend, or solve. But giving another person your full attention for a few minutes can produce a quality of connection that fragmented interaction cannot provide. A disciplined approach to attention does not require rejecting technology, entertainment, news, or social interaction. It requires deciding when and why you use them. There is a difference between intentionally watching something for relaxation and opening an app because you feel mildly uncomfortable with silence. There is a difference between checking the news at a chosen time and repeatedly refreshing updates because uncertainty feels difficult. The behavior may look identical from the outside, but internally the difference is whether you are directing your attention or reacting to an impulse. At the end of each day, you can ask yourself a simple but revealing question. What received most of my attention today, and did it deserve that much? Your answer may surprise you. Perhaps you gave an hour to a disagreement, 40 minutes to random information, and only 20 minutes to something that could improve your future. The purpose of this reflection is not guilt, it is awareness of allocation. Attention is one of the few resources you spend continuously without seeing a visible balance decrease. You notice lost money quickly. Lost attention can disappear quietly. As you become more deliberate, you begin to understand that protecting attention is not about becoming less curious or less responsive. It is about becoming more selective. You can care deeply without constantly monitoring. You can remain informed without consuming everything. You can be available to people without being permanently interrupted. You can think about problems without allowing them to occupy every quiet moment. This selectivity creates a calmer form of strength because your mind is no longer required to respond to every stimulus simply because it exists. Eventually, the question becomes larger than productivity. What you repeatedly give your attention to begins influencing what feels important, what you notice, what you remember, and what you practice. If your attention is consistently directed toward conflict, comparison, outrage, and fear, those subjects can become psychologically familiar. If it is directed toward learning, responsibility, relationships, meaningful work, and deliberate rest, those areas receive more mental development. You are not merely deciding what to look at, you are shaping what your mind becomes accustomed to considering important. But attention alone is not enough. You can protect your focus and still speak to yourself in ways that weaken your ability to act. You can concentrate for hours while internally questioning every decision, exaggerating every mistake, or demanding impossible standards from yourself. The next challenge is therefore more personal. Once you have learned where to place your attention, how can you use your own internal voice to strengthen action without becoming dependent on praise, reassurance, or constant emotional encouragement? Chapter 8. Practice constructive self-talk to influence decisions, emotions, and persistence. The way you speak to yourself during a difficult moment can change what you do next. You make a mistake at work, and one internal voice says, "I always mess things up." Another says, "That was a mistake. Find out what caused it and correct it." The situation is identical, but the second response gives you somewhere to go. The first turns an event into a judgment about identity, while the second turns it into a problem that can be addressed. This is the practical value of constructive self-talk. It is not about flattering yourself or repeating statements you do not believe. It is about using accurate, useful language when your emotions are strong enough to distort your judgment. Your internal dialogue influences more than mood. It affects what you notice, what you expect, and how much effort you are willing to continue making after difficulty appears. If you repeatedly tell yourself that a task is impossible, your attention begins searching for reasons to stop. If you tell yourself that the task is demanding but manageable one step at a time, your attention becomes more likely to search for the next workable action. This does not mean words magically change circumstances. They influence the instructions you give yourself while responding to those circumstances. A person who speaks internally with precision has a different decision-making environment from someone who constantly uses exaggeration, insult, and hopeless conclusions. One of the most common problems is that people use self-talk they would never use with someone they respect. Imagine a colleague making a small error. You would probably tell them to correct it, learn from it, and continue. Yet after making the same mistake yourself, you may say, "How could I be this stupid?" That sentence does not improve the next decision. It adds emotional pain without adding information. Constructive self-talk asks for a different standard. Be honest enough to identify the mistake and disciplined enough to avoid turning the mistake into an attack on yourself. This becomes particularly important after failure. Suppose you apply for a position and do not receive it. The first internal reaction may be disappointment, followed by, "I am clearly not good enough." That conclusion is much larger than the evidence. You were not selected for one position under particular circumstances. The reasons could include experience, timing, competition, internal decisions, or areas where you need development. A constructive response might be, "I did not get this opportunity. I need to identify what I can improve before the next one." That statement allows disappointment to exist without allowing it to become a permanent verdict. Self-talk also affects how you interpret effort. A person studying for an important exam may reach a difficult chapter and think, "I cannot understand this." That statement closes the mental process before the problem has been properly examined. A more useful internal instruction is, "I do not understand this section yet. I will identify the part I am missing and work through it. The difference between I cannot and I do not understand this yet is not a minor wording preference. One defines the problem as a fixed limitation. The other defines it as a current condition that may respond to effort, clarification, and time. However, constructive self-talk should not become constant reassurance. There are moments when you need to tell yourself something uncomfortable. If you are repeatedly missing deadlines, saying, "I am doing my best," may feel kind, but may not be useful if you are avoiding responsibility. A stronger internal statement might be, "My current system is not working, and I need to change it." That sentence contains accountability without humiliation. It allows you to admit that your behavior needs improvement while preserving the belief that improvement is possible. This balance is central to mature self-talk. Neither indulgence nor cruelty produces reliable discipline. Your internal language becomes especially powerful when emotions are intense. During anger, the mind often produces absolute statements. "This is unacceptable. They never listen. I have had enough." Some situations genuinely require firm boundaries, but emotional language can push you toward decisions that you later reconsider. Constructive self-talk can slow the process without denying the feeling. You might tell yourself, "I am angry, so I should be careful about what I say next." That sentence recognizes the emotion and creates a behavioral rule. You are not trying to become emotionless. You are deciding not to let temporary intensity determine permanent consequences. The same principle applies to anxiety. When facing an uncertain situation, the mind may repeatedly ask, "What if everything goes wrong?" A more useful question is, "What would I do if something goes wrong?" The first question generates endless scenarios because it seeks certainty. The second develops preparedness because it focuses on response. Imagine traveling for an important event and worrying about delays, lost luggage, or schedule changes. You cannot eliminate every possibility. You can prepare documents, allow extra time, and know what alternatives are available. Self-talk becomes constructive when it moves attention from uncontrollable prediction toward practical readiness. Persistence is another area where internal language matters. People often stop, not because they are incapable of continuing, but because their interpretation of difficulty becomes discouraging. If you are learning a new skill and think, "I should be better by now," frustration increases. If you think, "This is taking longer than I expected, so I need to adjust how I practice," frustration becomes information. The second thought protects persistence because it does not demand that progress match an imagined schedule. It allows you to remain committed while changing the method. There is also a difference between self-talk that directs behavior and self-talk that seeks emotional permission. "I need to feel motivated before I start," places action behind emotion. "I will begin for 15 minutes and reassess after that," places action first. The second approach is useful because starting often changes how a task feels. You do not need to convince yourself that the work will be enjoyable. You need to make the next step sufficiently clear that resistance does not control the decision. Good self-talk reduces unnecessary negotiation. Your internal voice can also help you recover from social embarrassment. Imagine that you make an awkward comment at a dinner and spend the rest of the night replaying it. Your mind may insist, "Everyone noticed, they will remember this." But you do not actually know how much attention other people gave the moment. They may have forgotten it minutes later. A constructive response would be, "I felt embarrassed, but the moment has passed. I can learn from it without repeatedly punishing myself." This allows social discomfort to fade naturally, instead of keeping it alive through repeated mental rehearsal. One practical exercise is to listen for recurring phrases in your private dialogue. You may notice, "I have to," "I cannot," I always, I never, they probably, or what if. These phrases are not automatically harmful, but repeated use can reveal how your mind frames situations. Replace vague judgments with specific descriptions. Instead of, I am terrible at this, identify what you are struggling with. Instead of, I have no time, identify what is consuming the available time. Instead of, nobody appreciates me, identify the particular relationship or situation that feels disappointing. Specific language creates specific problems, and specific problems are easier to address. Another useful practice is to prepare a few realistic statements for situations where you commonly lose control. Before a difficult meeting, you might remind yourself, listen fully before defending your position. Before starting demanding work, begin with the smallest defined part. After making a mistake, understand it, repair it, and continue. These statements work because they are behavioral. They do not demand a particular emotion. They tell you what to do while the emotion is present. Over time, repeated behavioral instructions can become automatic responses. The Stoic perspective adds another layer. Your internal voice should help you distinguish between what you wish were happening and what is actually happening. If someone disappoints you, you can say, I wanted a different response, but this is the response I received. Now I need to decide how to act. If a plan fails, this outcome is not what I wanted, but it is the situation I have. If you make a mistake, I cannot undo the event, but I can determine my next action. Such language does not make difficulty pleasant. It prevents difficulty from becoming an excuse for losing judgment. Over time, constructive self-talk changes the emotional atmosphere in which decisions are made. You become less dependent on external encouragement because you know how to guide yourself through ordinary resistance. You can acknowledge fear without exaggerating it, accept disappointment without surrendering to it, and correct mistakes without attacking yourself. Most importantly, you begin treating your internal voice as a tool for responsible action rather than a courtroom where you are constantly judged. But there is still a deeper problem. Even the most constructive internal dialogue can become ineffective if your thoughts and actions are moving in different directions. You may tell yourself that your goals matter while spending your days behaving as though they do not. You may speak confidently about discipline while repeatedly protecting habits that undermine it. Eventually, the mind notices that contradiction. And when it does, the next challenge is no longer simply what you say to yourself, but whether your daily actions are strong enough to make those words believable. Chapter 9. Align your thoughts with goals through focused daily actions. A goal can occupy your thoughts every day and still have almost no influence on your life. You can think about becoming healthier while continuing to organize your evenings around convenience. You can say you want a different career while spending every free hour consuming information instead of developing the skills required for the transition. You can want stronger relationships while repeatedly giving your attention to everything except the people closest to you. This contradiction is common because thinking about a goal can create a temporary feeling of progress without requiring the discomfort of action. The mind enjoys imagining a better future, but imagination alone does not create evidence that you are moving toward it. The real test of alignment is much simpler. If someone observed your ordinary day without hearing your intentions, would your behavior reveal what you claim to value? Goals become psychologically useful when they influence decisions at the level of the day. A distant objective such as, I want to build a successful business, is too broad to guide most ordinary moments. It does not tell you what to do at 9 in the morning when you are tired, when an email arrives, or when you have an hour of free time. A goal becomes actionable when you translate it into behaviors that can occur under normal conditions. Instead of asking whether you are becoming successful, ask what someone pursuing that goal would actually do today. Perhaps they would contact one potential client, study a specific skill, improve a product, review financial information, or spend an uninterrupted hour creating something useful. The goal provides direction, but the daily behavior provides movement. This distinction matters because the brain tends to value immediate rewards more strongly than distant benefits. Finishing a difficult task may produce a benefit months from now, while checking your phone produces stimulation immediately. Saving money can support future security, while spending provides immediate pleasure. Practicing a skill may eventually create opportunities, while entertainment requires no effort. The mind is therefore constantly comparing delayed outcomes with immediate experiences. If your goals remain abstract, immediate rewards often win because they are psychologically closer. One solution is to make the daily action itself meaningful enough to become part of your identity. You are not merely waiting for a distant result. You are practicing the behavior required to become capable of producing that result. Imagine someone who wants to become a writer but rarely writes because they are waiting for uninterrupted blocks of several hours. Their goal is real, but their standard for progress is unrealistic. They believe writing counts only when conditions are ideal. As a result, ordinary days produce no progress, and each missed day increases frustration. A more practical approach is to establish a minimum behavior that can survive ordinary life. Perhaps they write 500 deliberate words before opening entertainment in the evening. Some days they will do more. Other days the minimum will be enough. The important change is that the goal has been converted from an aspiration into a daily decision. The same principle applies to physical health. Someone may sincerely want to become stronger, but think about exercise in terms of an ideal future routine. They imagine waking early, spending an hour at the gym, preparing perfect meals, and maintaining an impressive schedule. When reality becomes complicated, the entire plan collapses. A more durable approach asks what the smallest serious version of the goal looks like on a difficult day. Perhaps it means completing a short workout, taking a deliberate walk, or preparing one balanced meal instead of ordering whatever is easiest. This does not mean lowering standards permanently. It means designing actions that remain possible when motivation and circumstances fluctuate. Alignment also requires deciding what you are willing to sacrifice. Every goal competes with something else. Time spent on one priority cannot simultaneously be spent on another. If you want to learn a valuable skill, some leisure time may need to decrease. If you want financial stability, certain purchases may need to become less frequent. If you want a stronger relationship, some attention currently given to devices or work may need to be redirected. People often say they lack time when the deeper issue is that their current priorities already consume the available time. Honest alignment requires asking not only, "What do I want?" but also, "What am I willing to stop doing so that this can have room?" This can be uncomfortable because giving something up makes a goal more real. As long as everything remains possible, you can maintain the comforting idea that you could pursue any direction whenever you choose. Once you commit time and resources, alternatives become less available. That can create anxiety, but meaningful progress usually requires accepting that every deliberate choice closes some other possibilities. This is not necessarily loss. It is the ordinary consequence of choosing a direction. A person who tries to preserve every option often makes no serious progress in any of them. Another problem appears when people measure progress only by visible outcomes. You can do everything responsibly for weeks without receiving immediate evidence that the effort is working. A new skill may still feel awkward. A business may still be small. Savings may still seem insignificant. A relationship may still require difficult conversations. If your motivation depends entirely on visible results, you may abandon useful behavior before it has enough time to produce consequences. A stronger measurement system includes process indicators. Did you practice? Did you make the necessary calls? Did you follow the spending boundary? Did you complete the planned work? These questions evaluate the part of the process you can actually influence. There is also value in reviewing whether your goals are genuinely yours. Some ambitions are inherited from family expectations, social comparison, or the desire to prove something to people who may not even be paying attention. You may pursue a title because you associate it with worth, buy things because they signal success, or chase a lifestyle because it looks impressive from the outside. When the goal is disconnected from your actual values, daily action becomes difficult because part of you does not believe the destination is worth the cost. Before demanding more discipline, ask whether the objective deserves your discipline. Responsibility includes choosing goals carefully, not merely forcing yourself to pursue whatever you previously decided. Suppose someone wants to earn substantially more money. That goal can represent very different underlying priorities. Perhaps they want financial security for their family. Perhaps they want freedom from debt. Perhaps they want recognition. Perhaps they are comparing themselves with friends. The appropriate daily actions will differ depending on the reason. If the real objective is security, aggressive status spending makes little sense. If the goal is freedom, increasing income while simultaneously increasing lifestyle expenses may create little progress. Clear thinking about the purpose behind a goal prevents effort from becoming disconnected from the result you actually want. Daily alignment also requires regular correction. Plans become outdated, responsibilities change, new information appears. A strategy that worked last year may no longer fit your circumstances. This does not mean abandoning goals whenever progress becomes difficult. It means evaluating whether the current method is still serving the objective. If you have studied for months without improving, perhaps the problem is not commitment, but the learning method. If your business activity is high, but results remain poor, perhaps you need better feedback rather than more hours. Persistence without reflection can become stubbornness. Responsible persistence includes adjusting the method while protecting the meaningful objective. One practical way to strengthen alignment is to begin each morning by identifying the one action that would make the day meaningfully closer to your chosen direction. Not 10 actions, not an elaborate schedule designed to make you feel productive, one action that matters. Complete it before allowing less important demands to consume the best part of your attention whenever circumstances permit. This creates a daily relationship between intention and behavior. At night, evaluate the action honestly. If you completed it, recognize the evidence. If you did not, identify what interfered and make the next adjustment. The purpose is not perfection. It is continuous contact between what you value and what you actually do. Over time, this alignment produces a subtle change in identity. You stop needing to constantly remind yourself what your goals are because your routines begin expressing them. Someone who values learning naturally creates time to study. Someone who values financial stability checks spending. Someone who values health plans food and movement. Someone who values meaningful relationships creates opportunities for undistracted connection. The goal becomes less of a statement and more of a pattern. That pattern is powerful because it does not depend entirely on motivation. The Stoic perspective here is straightforward. Focus your effort on what your actions can influence and accept that outcomes contain factors beyond your control. You can prepare thoroughly without controlling whether someone chooses you. You can practice consistently without controlling exactly when mastery arrives. You can behave with integrity without controlling whether everyone appreciates it. This protects you from two opposite errors. One is helplessness, where you refuse to act because outcomes are uncertain. The other is obsession, where you believe that enough effort guarantees a particular result. Neither is necessary. You can commit fully to the quality of your actions while remaining realistic about the uncertainty surrounding results. Eventually, your goals stop being distant statements about who you hope to become and start becoming standards for how you spend an ordinary Tuesday. That is when the mind and behavior begin moving in the same direction. Yet, even aligned action can become temporary if it is not supported by a broader transformation in identity and daily practice. The final question is therefore not simply whether you can act toward a goal for a few weeks, but whether you can build a way of living in which your thoughts, choices, and repeated actions consistently produce the person you intend to become. Chapter 10. Transform your mindset by consistently becoming what you repeatedly practice. At some point, the question stops being what you believe and becomes what your daily behavior proves you believe. You can say that health matters, but your routine reveals how seriously you treat it. You can say that family matters, but your calendar reveals how much attention you consistently give them. You can say that learning matters, but your evenings reveal whether you regularly make room for it. This is where personal transformation becomes concrete. Your mind influences your actions, but repeated actions also influence your mind. Every behavior you practiced teaches you something about what is normal, possible, difficult, and worth continuing. Over time, repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity begins to feel natural. The person you become is therefore shaped not only by the thoughts you consciously choose, but by the behaviors you repeatedly reinforce. This explains why occasional effort rarely produces lasting change. A person can spend one highly motivated weekend organizing their life, exercising, reading, planning, and preparing healthy meals, then return to old routines the following week. The experience may feel inspiring, but inspiration has limited influence when it is not converted into repetition. The mind does not change its expectations because of one impressive performance. It changes through accumulated evidence. If you repeatedly wake at a certain time, work despite moderate resistance, communicate honestly, or stop spending impulsively, those behaviors become increasingly familiar. Eventually, you spend less energy deciding whether to do them because they have become part of your normal pattern. This does not mean habits make people permanently fixed. Human beings remain capable of change, sometimes at surprising points in life. But change becomes easier to understand when you recognize that old patterns are supported by repetition. If you have spent years avoiding difficult conversations, your first attempts at direct communication may feel unnatural. If you have spent years responding immediately to every notification, focused work may initially feel strangely quiet. If you have spent years criticizing yourself after mistakes, a measured response may feel almost too forgiving. The discomfort does not prove that the new behavior is wrong. It often indicates that your nervous system is accustomed to the old pattern. A practical way to change this is to stop asking, "What kind of person do I want to be?" as though the answer should remain abstract. Ask instead, "What would that person repeatedly do?" If you want to become dependable, what behaviors demonstrate dependability? You arrive when you said you would. You communicate when plans change. You finish responsibilities instead of disappearing when they become inconvenient. If you want to become calm under pressure, you practice delaying unnecessary reactions. You listen before responding. You create space between emotion and action. If you want to become intellectually honest, you admit when evidence contradicts your position. Identity becomes useful when it produces observable standards. There is also an important difference between practicing a behavior and performing it occasionally under ideal conditions. Anyone can appear disciplined when motivation is high, the schedule is empty, and circumstances are favorable. The deeper test appears on ordinary days. You slept poorly. Your workload increased. Someone irritated you. The plan changed. You feel discouraged. These moments reveal which behaviors have become stable enough to survive inconvenience. This is why small, repeatable standards can be more transformative than extreme challenges. A behavior that survives ordinary difficulty has a greater chance of becoming part of your character. Imagine someone trying to become more patient. They may think patience means never feeling irritated. That standard is unrealistic and can create frustration. A more practical definition is behavioral. When irritation appears, they will slow down before responding. They will avoid sending the angry message immediately. They will ask one question before making an accusation. They will leave a conversation temporarily if continuing would make the situation worse. None of these actions guarantees calm emotions, but repeated practice changes what happens after irritation appears. Eventually, the person may still feel anger, but their behavior becomes more controlled. That is meaningful transformation because character is expressed through conduct, not the absence of difficult emotions. Repeated practice also changes your relationship with discomfort. At first, disciplined behavior can feel like something imposed on you. You may have to consciously choose it. Over time, the same behavior can become less psychologically expensive. A person who regularly exercises no longer has to debate the value of every workout. A person who routinely saves money becomes less emotionally attached to unnecessary purchases. Someone who practices honest communication becomes less tempted to avoid every uncomfortable conversation. The environment has not necessarily become easier. The person has become more accustomed to acting according to chosen standards. This is why consistency matters more than intensity in many areas of personal development. Intensity can produce impressive short-term results, but consistency teaches the mind what to expect. If you study for 6 hours once and then do nothing for a week, your knowledge may improve temporarily, but your relationship with study remains unstable. If you study for 45 minutes most days, you create a reliable pattern. The same principle applies to exercise, writing, financial management, relationships, and emotional regulation. Repetition gives behavior a chance to become familiar enough that it no longer depends entirely on conscious effort. There will be periods when the process feels slow. You may practice a new behavior for weeks without noticing a dramatic difference. This is where many people abandon useful routines. They evaluate progress according to emotion rather than evidence. They ask, "Do I feel transformed yet?" A better question is, what do I do differently now than I did before? Perhaps you recover from mistakes faster. Perhaps you procrastinate less. Perhaps you communicate more directly. Perhaps you notice emotional reactions earlier. Perhaps you are making fewer decisions that you later regret. These changes may not feel dramatic, but they are evidence that repeated practice is affecting behavior. You should also expect setbacks without interpreting them as proof that transformation has failed. A person developing financial discipline may make an impulsive purchase. Someone improving emotional control may lose their temper. A person building a consistent routine may have an unproductive week. The important question is what happens afterward. If one setback becomes an excuse to abandon the entire process, the old pattern regains control. If the setback becomes information, the process continues. You can examine what caused the lapse, Adjust the conditions and resume the behavior without turning the event into a dramatic judgment about yourself. Responsibility becomes especially important here because change requires ownership of repetition. Your environment influences you, your past influences you, and other people's behavior affects your circumstances, but you still participate in the patterns you reinforce. If you repeatedly tolerate something that damages your priorities, that tolerance becomes part of your routine. If you repeatedly postpone an important responsibility, postponement becomes easier. If you repeatedly respond to stress with distraction, distraction becomes your default response. Recognizing this is not about blaming yourself for everything. It is about identifying where your participation gives a pattern continued existence. There is a quiet form of freedom in recognizing that you can practice differently. You may not be able to change your history. You cannot erase previous mistakes or guarantee that circumstances will cooperate with your intentions, but the next repetition is still available. The next conversation can be handled differently. The next purchase can be considered more carefully. The next hour can be used more deliberately. The next reaction can be delayed. Transformation becomes less mysterious when you see it as a series of available repetitions rather than one enormous decision. Your standards should therefore be visible in your calendar, your environment, your spending, your conversations, and your use of attention. If you claim that something matters, but your routine consistently gives it the leftovers, the routine is revealing a conflict that your words cannot resolve. This is not a reason for shame, it is useful information. Your schedule is one of the clearest records of what you repeatedly practice. Look at it honestly. What behaviors receive your best energy? What behaviors receive the remainder? What do you repeatedly make time for, even when you say you are too busy? These questions can reveal priorities more accurately than intentions alone. A mature mindset also accepts that becoming someone new does not require rejecting everything about who you have been. Some old patterns may have served useful purposes in earlier circumstances. Avoiding conflict may once have protected you. Constant vigilance may once have helped you manage uncertainty. Working excessively may once have helped you create stability. The goal is not to condemn your past self for adapting to life as it appeared then. The goal is to decide whether those adaptations remain appropriate now. Growth sometimes means keeping the strength while changing the behavior attached to it. The Stoic perspective brings the process back to what can actually be practiced. You cannot command yourself to become wise, disciplined, resilient, or courageous by declaring those qualities important. You develop them by repeatedly choosing behaviors that express them. Courage is practiced when you act responsibly despite uncertainty. Discipline is practiced when you follow a chosen standard despite temporary resistance. Resilience is practiced when you recover without surrendering your direction. Self-respect is practiced when your actions remain consistent with what you know to be right, even when nobody is watching. Eventually, you begin to notice that the mind you have been trying to improve is also being shaped by the life you repeatedly live. Your thoughts influence your choices become behaviors, behaviors become patterns, and patterns begin influencing what feels natural to you. This process works whether you use it deliberately or not. That is why the central responsibility is not to control every thought or create a perfect life. It is to become increasingly deliberate about what you repeat. The deepest change may be quieter than you expect. One day, you may notice that a behavior that once required constant effort now feels normal. You handle a difficult conversation without rehearsing every possible outcome. You begin important work without waiting for perfect motivation. You recover from mistakes without questioning your entire worth. You protect your attention without feeling guilty for saying no. You make decisions according to your values, even when no immediate reward is available. Nothing dramatic announces the transformation. You simply recognize that your repeated practice has changed what you consider normal. And that realization leaves one final question worth carrying beyond these pages. If your thoughts influence your actions, and your repeated actions influence the person you become, then every ordinary day is quietly participating in your future identity. The question is no longer whether your mind is shaping your life. It is whether you are willing to become deliberate about what you give it to practice next.